A short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people. Its menacing activities directly endanger the United States, our troops, our bases overseas, and our allies throughout the world. For 47 years, the Iranian regime has chanted death to America and waged an unending campaign of bloodshed and mass murder, targeting the United States, our troops, and the innocent people in many, many countries. Among the regime's very first acts was to back a violent takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, holding dozens of American hostages for 444 days. In 1983, Iran's proxies carried out the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut that killed 241 American military personnel.
Hey people, John here. So what just happened, guys? Trump has declared there will be no deal or negotiation with Iran. Only unconditional surrender, and told the Revolutionary Guard to lay down arms or face certain death. The ultimatum, delivered alongside simultaneous airstrikes on Tehran and Beirut, leaves no room for diplomacy and signals a maximalist escalation with no off-ramp. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The White House privately told people the military campaign could last 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks, not 4 to 6 days. Not a quick, decisive strike that would be over before the public even had time to process it. A campaign running for over a month, with all of the costs and casualties and consequences that implies. And Trump is standing in front of the world saying, surrender unconditionally or die.
In 2000, they knew and were probably involved with the attack on the USS Cole. Many died. Iranian forces killed and maimed hundreds of American service members in Iraq. The regime's proxies have continued to launch countless attacks against American forces stationed in the Middle East in recent years, as well as U.S. naval and commercial vessels in international shipping lanes. It's been mass terror, and we're not going to put up with it any longer. From Lebanon to Yemen and Syria to Iraq, the regime has armed, trained, and funded terrorist militias that have soaked the earth with blood and guts. And it was Iran's proxy, Hamas, that launched the monstrous October 7th attacks on Israel, slaughtering more than 1,000 innocent people, including 46 Americans, while taking 12 of our citizens hostage. It was brutal, something like the world has never seen before. Iran is the world's #1 state sponsor of terror.
That is where we are right now. And if you do not find that alarming, you are not paying close enough attention to what's actually unfolding. This is the kind of rhetoric that history books look back on and identify as the moment when everything changed, the inflection point when the path toward war became irreversible. And the fact that it's being delivered with such casual confidence while bombs are falling makes it all the more unsettling. So let's just establish what we know from the verified reporting, because every element of this story is confirmed by major outlets and international news organizations that have been covering this situation from every angle. Reports confirmed on March 6th that Trump said there will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. That is not a paraphrase, not a journalist interpretation of what he meant.
And just recently killed tens of thousands of its own citizens on the street as they protested. It has always been the policy of the United States, in particular, my administration, that this terrorist regime can never have a nuclear weapon. I'll say it again. They can never have a nuclear weapon. That is why in Operation Midnight Hammer last June, we obliterated the regime's nuclear program at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. After that attack, we warned them never to resume their malicious pursuit of nuclear weapons, and we sought repeatedly to make a deal We tried. They wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. Again, they wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. They didn't know what was happening. They just wanted to practice evil. But Iran refused, just as it has for decades and decades. They've rejected every opportunity to renounce their nuclear ambitions.
That is the framing that was directly reported and verified by international news organizations that have been tracking every development in this escalating crisis. The BBC reported the White House was signaling the military campaign could run 4 to 6 weeks, a timeline that should be setting off alarm bells in every defense ministry across the globe. The Guardian confirmed strikes were continuing over Tehran and Beirut as Trump made these demands, making it crystal clear that the military action is not pausing for diplomacy or negotiation. And The Independent reported Trump directly addressed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, telling soldiers to lay down their arms or face certain death.
And we can't take it anymore. Instead, they attempted to rebuild their nuclear program and to continue developing long-range missiles that can now threaten our very good friends and allies in Europe, our troops stationed overseas, and could soon reach the American homeland. Just imagine how emboldened this regime would be if they ever had and actually were armed with nuclear weapons as a means to deliver their message. For these reasons, the United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. We're going to annihilate their Navy. We're going to ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region or the world and attack our forces and no longer use their IEDs or...
And then the BBC also reported that Trump floated the idea that after regime change, after the current Iranian government is removed, the United States could help restore and rebuild Iran. So the full picture here is unconditional surrender, potential regime change, a rebuild plan for after, and a military campaign that the White House itself is saying could run for over a month. This is not a limited strike. This is a comprehensive war plan being announced in public while bombs are dropping. Can you believe this? Now here's the part I really want you to focus on, because the surrender demand is getting the headlines, and it should. But the 4 to 6 week timeline is the piece that tells you the most about what is actually being planned here.
Roadside bombs, as they are sometimes called, to so gravely wound and kill thousands and thousands of people, including many Americans. And we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. It's a very simple message. They will never have a nuclear weapon. This regime will soon learn that no one should challenge the strength and might of the United States Armed Forces. I built and rebuilt our military in my first administration, and there is no military on earth even close to its power, strength, or sophistication. My administration has taken every possible step to minimize the risk to U.S. personnel in the region. Even so, and I do not make this statement lightly, the Iranian regime seeks to kill. The lives of courageous American heroes may be lost, and we may have casualties. That often happens in war. But we're doing this not for now. We're doing this for the future, and it is a noble mission.
When a government goes to the public and says its military campaign will last 4 to 6 weeks, what it is actually saying is, this is bigger than we told you. This is going to cost more than we told you. More people on both sides are going to be in danger for longer than we told you. And the bill, already running toward $90 billion in supplemental funding requests, is going to keep climbing because 4 to 6 weeks of sustained military operations at the level being described does not come cheap. And it does not come without consequences that ripple out beyond the battlefield. Markets, oil prices, shipping routes, alliances, All of it gets more complicated with every week this runs. So we are breaking all of that down today. What the surrender demand really means, why the timeline matters enormously, and what the endgame could actually look like. Let me start with the language, because language in war is never just language. It is a signal, a commitment, a boundary that once crossed cannot be uncrossed. When Trump used the phrase unconditional surrender in reference to Iran, he was invoking something very specific and very loaded in American political and military history. The United States has demanded unconditional surrender from an enemy exactly twice in its modern history. World War II, Japan, and Germany. Those were total wars that ended with the complete dismantling of the enemy's military forces, its government, its ability to resist in any form. The countries were occupied and new governments were installed. Constitutions were written under American supervision. The enemy stopped existing as it previously had and was rebuilt from the ground up under American and Allied influence over years and years of sustained commitment. That is what unconditional surrender has meant when Americans use it. It is not a phrase that means we reached the deal we are happy with. It means the other side has nothing left to negotiate with and no choice but to accept whatever is offered. And Trump just applied that standard to Iran, a country of nearly 90 million people with a highly educated and deeply nationalistic population, a country with a revolutionary guard that has been fighting, adapting, and surviving American pressure for over 4 decades. A country that has built an entire network of regional allies and proxy forces, specifically designed to maintain leverage even when the core military is under pressure. A country whose supreme leader has built his entire political identity and the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic itself around the idea of resistance to exactly this kind of demand. And Trump is saying that is the only deal we will accept. Unconditional, nothing less. And you have 20 countries watching to see what happens next. Come on. Now let's talk about the direct threat to the Revolutionary Guard, because this is a significant escalation in tone that has not gotten the attention it deserves. Trump specifically addressed members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and told them to lay down their arms or face certain death. That is the kind of language that generals use in final stages of a conflict when victory is imminent and they are offering the losing side a last chance to stop dying for a cause that has already failed. It is the language of a commander who believes he is in total control of the battlefield and is offering mercy as an alternative to annihilation. But here is the problem with using that language. When the White House is simultaneously saying the campaign could last 4 to 6 weeks, if the war is already won, if the Iranian military is already broken, why would the campaign need another month? The language of total dominance and the reality of a multi-week ongoing campaign do not fit together cleanly. And that gap between the rhetoric and the reality is the thing that should be making people ask hard questions right now. Are you kidding me? And then there is the regime change element, because this is where the story gets even more consequential. The BBC reported that Trump framed the campaign in terms of what comes after, suggesting the United States could help restore Iran following regime change. Restore Iran. That is an enormous phrase because restoration implies responsibility. It implies a commitment of resources, time, personnel, and political capital that goes far beyond the military campaign itself. It implies that the United States is not just trying to stop Iran from doing something, it is trying to fundamentally reshape what Iran is as a country and a government. And here's the thing about that. The United States has done regime change before. It has attempted to rebuild countries after removing their governments. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. And in every case, every single one, the reconstruction phase turned out to be harder, more expensive, more complicated, and more damaging to American interests than the initial military campaign. The lesson from every one of those experiences is the same. Toppling a government is the easy part. What comes after is where things fall apart. And Trump is now floating a restoration plan for a country of 90 million people with deep institutional structures, a complex regional network of allied militias and proxy forces, and a population that has been told for decades that the United States is the enemy. This is wild. Let me zoom out now and think about what the 4 to 6 week timeline actually means in practice. Because this is a number that tells you more about the true scale of what is happening than any single press statement or surrender demand. If the White House is signaling privately that the campaign could last 4 to 6 weeks, that is 30 to 42 days of sustained military operations. That is not a surgical strike. That is not a brief show of force designed to send a message and then pull back. That is a campaign. Airstrikes continuing over major urban areas day after day. Naval assets deployed and maintaining operational posture in some of the most strategically contested waters in the world. Intelligence operations running continuously. Ammunition being burned through at the rate we already know is happening, based on the $21 billion munitions replenishment request that the White House has already sent to Congress. Personnel deployed in harm's way for over a month. Logistics chains under sustained pressure. And all of that happening while the global economy is simultaneously absorbing the shocks of an active conflict over one of the world's most critical energy shipping corridors. 30 to 42 days at that operational tempo costs an enormous amount of money. It produces an enormous amount of destruction in Iran, in Lebanon, where Beirut is also being struck, and in the regional stability that American allies in the Gulf, in Europe, and across Asia depend on to function economically and politically. And nobody, not Congress, not the American public, not the allies watching nervously from the sidelines, was given a clear and honest picture of that scope when this conflict was being described at the beginning. That is a serious accountability gap, and it is one that is going to widen the longer this runs. Here is another angle on this that is not getting enough coverage. When Trump says the only deal is unconditional surrender, and when the military is privately signaling a 4 to 6 week campaign, what that combination tells you is that there is no negotiated exit being planned for. There is no diplomatic track running alongside the military one. There is no back channel to a ceasefire. There is no intermediary being lined up to bridge the gap between the American maximalist position and the Iranian refusal to capitulate. The strategy as it is being described publicly is purely military. Hit hard, keep hitting until the other side breaks or surrenders. And that approach, which has a name in military doctrine, is the approach that produces the highest casualty counts, the most infrastructure destruction, the deepest long-term instability, and the most complicated aftermath. Because countries that are broken by force, rather than brought to the table through negotiation, tend not to stay broken in the way the victors imagine. They tend to produce resistance movements, successor conflicts, and decades of blowback. The history of the 21st century is basically a tutorial on this lesson. And here we are again. This is why. Let's also talk about what the strikes on Beirut mean, because that dimension of this story has been underplayed. The Guardian confirmed that strikes were continuing over both Tehran and Beirut, as these surrender demands were being made. Beirut, Lebanon, a separate country, a country with its own government and its own population, millions of people who are not Iranian and are not part of the Iranian government. The strikes on Beirut are connected to the Hezbollah dimension of this conflict, Hezbollah being the Iranian-aligned Lebanese militia that has been involved in the regional escalation. But striking Beirut while simultaneously demanding Iran's unconditional surrender expands the geographic scope of this conflict in ways that have enormous implications. Lebanon is not a stable state. Beirut is a city that has already been devastated by years of economic collapse and political dysfunction, and bringing it back into active combat is going to produce consequences for the Lebanese people, for the regional balance, for European governments that have deep ties to Lebanon, and for the humanitarian picture that are not going to be resolved in 4 to 6 weeks. So let's break it all the way down. 4 clean points, 4 things that you need to hold on to when you think about what the surrender demand and the 4 to 6 week timeline really mean and what they tell us about where this is all heading. The maximalist demand closes off every negotiated exit and leaves only bad options. When Trump says the only deal is unconditional surrender, publicly on the record confirmed by Reuters, with no conditions or qualifications attached, he is not leaving himself a diplomatic off-ramp. He is not creating space for a third-party mediator to come in and find a formula that both sides can present to their domestic audiences as acceptable. He is saying there is one outcome, and it is total, complete, unconditional victory. And the problem with that position stated that clearly, that publicly, with that level of commitment, is that total victory over a country the size and complexity of Iran is not something that gets achieved in 4 to 6 weeks of airstrikes. Airstrikes can destroy infrastructure. They can degrade military capability. They can impose enormous costs on the civilian population. But they cannot by themselves produce the kind of comprehensive institutional collapse that unconditional surrender requires. The Iranian government has deep redundancy built into it, specifically because it has been planning for this kind of scenario for years. It has underground command facilities. It has distributed leadership structures. It has a political and ideological framework that is explicitly designed to present survival as resistance and resistance as survival. The Revolutionary Guard Corps is not going to lay down its arms because Trump used the phrase certain death in a press statement. And so the gap between what the demand requires and what the military campaign can realistically deliver in the stated time frame sets up a situation with two bad exits. Either the demand gets quietly walked back, which is politically catastrophic for an administration whose whole brand is strength and resolve, or the campaign keeps going well past 4 to 6 weeks at enormous and escalating costs. Neither option is good, and both were predictable from the moment the demand was made. The 4 to 6 week timeline was always going to be optimistic, and history says we should be worried about that. Here is a pattern that holds across basically every modern American military campaign. The initial timeline is almost always wrong. Iraq was supposed to be weeks. The major combat phase was declared over in 3 weeks, and then the country burned for another 2 decades. Afghanistan was described in terms of months. At the beginning, it turned into 20 years. Libya's intervention was supposed to be limited. It produced a failed state that is still fragmented today. And the 4 to 6 week signal coming from the White House on the Iran campaign has that same quality. It is a projection made at the beginning of a conflict, before the full scope of resistance is known, before the complications of urban warfare and proxy forces and regional escalation across multiple countries are fully accounted for, before the political dimensions of regime change have had time to fully develop, and before the Iranian government has shown what it is actually willing to do in response to sustained military pressure. The Revolutionary Guard Corps does not simply dissolve because an air campaign continues. It adapts, it disperses, it shifts tactics, it leverages its regional network to open new fronts and create new complications. And the moment the 4 to 6 week timeline starts slipping, the moment it becomes 6 weeks, then 9, then 12, the political pressure on the administration from every direction intensifies in ways that are very hard to manage. The American public starts asking why the projection was wrong. Congress starts demanding answers about what the new timeline is and what it is going to cost. Allies who have been holding back their criticism start speaking up. And the cost, financial, human, diplomatic, political, compounds with every week beyond the original projection. That is not speculation. That is a documented history of every comparable military campaign the United States has undertaken in this century. Regime change and restoration is a commitment that goes way beyond the campaign. This is the element that has the longest shadow over everything else being discussed right now. When Trump framed the post-conflict vision as restoring Iran after regime change, when the BBC reported that as the White House's stated end goal, the administration added an enormous layer of commitment to what is already a massive military undertaking. Because restoring a country after regime change is not a 4 to 6 week project. It is not a $100 billion project. It is the kind of commitment that takes years, sometimes decades, and consumes resources and political attention at a scale that reshapes American foreign policy for a generation. Look at Iraq. The invasion took 3 weeks. The reconstruction is still unfinished 2 decades later. The political vacuum created by removing Saddam Hussein created the conditions for ISIS. The instability produced by that regime change rippled across the entire region for years. Iran is a larger country with a more entrenched government, a more complex regional network, and a more hostile population toward American involvement. If the restoration plan is real, if the administration is genuinely committed to helping rebuild Iran after regime change, then the American public is being asked to sign up for something that goes far beyond what any 4 to 6 week military timeline suggests. And they deserve to know that. The Beirut strikes expand this conflict in ways that will be very hard to contain. When The Guardian confirmed that strikes were hitting Beirut alongside Tehran, when the geographic scope of this campaign extended beyond Iran's borders into Lebanon, the conflict stopped being a bilateral showdown between the United States and Iran and became something fundamentally more complex and more dangerous. Beirut is not a military base in a desert somewhere. It is a dense urban center, a city of over 2 million people that is already fragile in every sense of the word, economically destroyed by years of financial crisis, politically paralyzed by a government that can barely function, and physically scarred by an explosion in 2020 that flattened a significant portion of its port and surrounding neighborhoods. Striking it now as part of a campaign targeting Hezbollah infrastructure embedded throughout the city brings Lebanon into the active conflict zone in a way that triggers every regional tension that has been building for years simultaneously. It puts the Lebanese government, which has been trying to walk a very careful line between its Iranian-aligned and Western-aligned factions, in an impossible position. It gives every armed group from Yemen to Syria to Iraq new grievances, new narratives, and new justifications for involvement. It generates civilian casualty figures and humanitarian images that shape how the Arab world, Europe, and the global South interpret American actions. And that interpretation matters enormously for the diplomatic and political dimensions of whatever comes after the shooting. And it makes the already deeply complicated question of regional stabilization, once the conflict ends, orders of magnitude harder to answer. The conflict is already bigger than most Americans were told to expect. The scope from Iran to Beirut, the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, is already enormous. And every additional front that opens makes the exit harder to find and the reconstruction more daunting to contemplate. So where does this leave us? Trump has demanded unconditional surrender from Iran in public, on the record confirmed by Reuters, with no qualifications and no diplomatic off-ramp attached. He has told Iranian Revolutionary Guard members to surrender or face certain death. The White House has privately signaled the campaign could last 4 to 6 weeks, which history without exception suggests should be treated as an optimistic floor and not a reliable ceiling. Airstrikes are hitting Tehran and Beirut simultaneously. Regime change is being openly discussed as a goal. And a restoration plan for a country of 90 million people is being floated as the post-conflict vision, the same kind of restoration plan that produced 20 years of unresolved conflict in Iraq. Every single one of those facts carries enormous implications for what comes next, for the military campaign and how long it actually runs, for the American Treasury and how much this ultimately costs, for the regional stability that the entire global economy has a stake in, and for the credibility of an administration that sold this as a decisive use of American strength that would produce quick, clear, definitive results in a matter of weeks. The gap between that promise and the reality unfolding on the ground right now is already wide. And based on everything we know from history about how these kinds of campaigns actually unfold, it is going to keep widening. So stay locked in, because the next video we are going to look at what history actually tells us about what comes after demands like this one, and whether unconditional surrender has ever worked the way the people demanding it think it will.